With all of the hardware and all the guns that it had on it, it truly was a flying fortress.
The Flying Fortress bombers suffered one of the highest attrition rates of any aircraft in history. Around 4,750 B-17s were lost in combat during World War II. And when you remember that each one carried a 10-man crew, you can see how horrifying that number really is. We're going to show you just how bad someone's job could get throughout the story of what became the most famous bomber in history. So, after World War I, the major powers realized that the nature of war had changed completely. The horrors of trench warfare forced everyone to rethink their strategy, and that's when militaries started focusing heavily on more advanced weapons, especially aircraft. Bombers became the next big idea because many strategists believed they could break through enemy defenses and change the whole game of warfare. By the 1930s, this focus on bombers really took off in the United States. The Air Corps wanted to modernize and replace those old fabric-covered planes with new all-metal ones. So in 1934, they put out a call for a new long-range bomber. It had to fly at 250 miles per hour, reach 10,000 feet, and cover 2,000 miles without refueling. The Air Corps told companies they had to fund their own prototypes, and whoever won would get a contract for 220 planes. At that time, Boeing was nearly bankrupt, but they took a massive gamble. They poured everything into one design, the Model 299, which soon became America's first all-metal four-engine bomber. It actually went far beyond what the Air Corps asked for, and that was how the Flying Fortress's story began. There's an anecdote that a journalist saw all its gun positions and called it a flying fortress, and the name stuck. But right from the start, things went horribly wrong when Boeing's prototype crashed after takeoff, resulting in 2 pilots dead. That accident disqualified Boeing from the big contract, which instead went to the Douglas DB-1, and the Air Corps ordered 133 of those instead. Still, a small number of then designated YB-17s were bought for testing, and Boeing kept improving them. They built just 10 of those early bombers, and nobody could have guessed how quickly things were about to change when September 1939 came. Europe was at war. Tensions with Japan were rising, and the United States was watching it all unfold, realizing it would need far more bombers very soon. Douglas was struggling with production, and its bombers weren't powerful enough for what America needed. Boeing's B-17 was actually the only operational heavy bomber they had, and there were only about 30 of them. With little else available, Boeing was given as much money as needed, and ordered to ramp up production of B-17 ASAP. They began adding more gun turrets and preparing the B-17s the best they could for the upcoming war. About 20 of these YB-17s were sent to Britain for the Royal Air Force, and again another tragedy followed when one crashed during travel after a power failure. However, things would get much worse than that once the planes saw combat for the first time. A lone group of early B-17s in hands of the British Royal Air Force was sent to bomb a shipbuilding centre in Germany. The mission quickly fell apart when the guns froze at high altitude. The bombs missed their target by a wide margin, and German fighters attacked them. These early versions didn't even have tail gunners, and most of their defensive weapons were lighter 30 caliber guns instead of the heavier 50s. When they met Luftwaffe pilots who were then among the most experienced in the world, the results were as bad as you might expect. Those early B-17s also didn't have armor around critical parts. Flak fragments ripped straight through the fuselage in daylight raids, cutting oil and fuel lines and shredding the crews inside. The first few missions ended terribly, mostly because of inexperience, weak tactics, and early design flaws. The Allies had never done anything like this before, and learning on the go cost them horrifying numbers of lives on every mission, and it was only going to get worse. Because of that, the British actually pulled the B-17 from European service. Meanwhile, the Americans started using them in the Pacific as tensions with Japan kept growing, and when Pearl Harbor was attacked, 12 B-17s were destroyed on the ground. During this time, the B-17 began flying reconnaissance in the Pacific, and soon dropped its first bombs on a Japanese naval convoy. But it was in Europe that the Flying Fortress would face its real test, with missions that would become some of the worst in aviation history. Basically, once it became clear how crucial it was to hit German factories and infrastructure in Europe, the US set up the 8th Air Force over in England and teamed up with the British Royal Air Force for a joint bombing campaign. The idea was to fly across the Channel into German-occupied Europe and bomb the vital targets the Germans needed to keep their war machine going, like oil refineries, U-boat yards, and aircraft factories. But beyond military targets, they also turned to what was called terror bombing. This meant attacking towns and cities to try to scare the population, maybe break their will to fight, and this way shorten the war. The hope was that bombing Germany into submission might force an earlier unconditional surrender. But the Germans didn't let that happen easily. The The British had learned the hard way that daylight bombing was basically asking to get your bombers shot down, so they switched to night raids, sacrificing precision for less risk from flak and fighters. The Americans, though, stuck to daytime bombing because they believed tight formations and multiple 50 caliber machine guns pointing out in all directions would protect them, while using the Norden bomb sight to surgically hit the most vital targets. The Norden bomb sight was a highly guarded secret at the time. It was a device used for aiming and calculating where the bombs would fall. Bombardier would actually, through the early form of autopilot, control the bomber through bomb sight during the bomb run. However, it is estimated that early in the war, about 80% of bombs missed their targets due to many factors. So this now meant that the Allies were effectively bombing around the clock. And in theory, it sounded great. But reality would have a say in it as well. First daylight missions took such terrible losses that the whole idea was nearly cancelled more than once. Now, why did so many B-17 crews get killed? It boiled down to 3 dark facts, and 2 of them had to do with how the Germans fought back. First, fighters. Early on, the plan was that B-17s would fly without long-range fighter escort, because fighters back then simply didn't have the fuel capacity to go all the way deep into Germany and back. Fighters could only protect the bombers for part of the route, until they had to peel off and head home when they'd hit the range limit. That left the bombers alone and vulnerable deep over enemy territory. As long-range escort fighters were developed and put into service, the situation improved later in the war, but not before the losses were already catastrophic. The Germans also adapted fast. They started packing their fighters with heavier armament and changing their tactics specifically to kill bombers. Pilots learned to attack in coordinated slashing runs or head-on attacks, and late in the war, they even used first air-to-air rockets and first-ever jet fighters like Me-262s. Now about the defensive fire on the B-17s. When they added tail turrets, dorsal turrets and more 50 caliber M2 Brownings, the tail gun became one of the most effective gun positions. The tail is a relatively stable firing platform, so tail gunners could bring twin 50s to bear on an attacker and didn't have to lead the target the same way a waist gunner would. That gave them better chances of accurate hits head-on at the fighters attacking from the rear, and that is why tail gunners usually carried most of the ammo. But fighters only accounted for part of the problem. The other half of the losses came from anti-aircraft artillery, famously known as flak. The standard 88mm anti-aircraft cannon fired a shell weighing roughly 9 to 10 kilograms at very high velocity, giving it a ceiling high enough to reach bomber formations. Batteries would set the time fuses to burst shells at altitude where the bombers were, spreading out hundreds or thousands of high-velocity fragments. These fragments could shred the thin skin of a B-17, sever fuel and oil lines, hit control runs, and do horrible damage to the human body that we can't even describe without this video going down from YouTube. The Germans used the Kommando-Gerät fire control analog computers and optical 4-meter stereoscopic rangefinders, and later integrated data from Würzburg radars to calculate precise firing angles and fuse timings. This highly sophisticated analog computer took range, speed, and altitude inputs and calculated in real time the elevation and azimuth that each gun needed, then fed those settings through electrical cables to the battery's guns. In practice, that meant whole batteries of 4 or more 88s could work as a coordinated system to put timed bursts into the sky right where the bombers would fly. Still, flak was not an easy job either. To actually score a hit, you had to get all the data right with relatively primitive technology compared to what we have today, while your target changed speed and direction, knowing that the shell needed about 20 to 30 seconds of flight time to reach them. So every 30 seconds approximately, bomber formation would slightly change course or altitude to make your job as a flak gunner much more difficult. Even perfectly calculated flak volley could miss completely because bombers flew unpredictably on purpose. But the Germans fought back with radar and better fire control data, and the Allies then countered with electronic measures and radar jamming. The jamming and countermeasures were a constant technical duel. Germans refined their radar and integration. Allies tried chaff, noise jamming, and tactics to degrade the fire control picture in a constant cat-and-mouse game. Still, once the bombers were on the bomb run, there wasn't much they could do, because to aim the bombs accurately, the formation had to fly straight and level for a brief period of time, which made them sitting ducks for the flak. Germans eventually started firing more by volume and less by precise aiming, essentially saturating the space the bombers had to fly through so that sheer numbers of fired shells would guarantee some hits, because everything became unpredictable once the Allies started countering their radars and flying evasively. It was terrifying and random, and there was often nothing the men on board could do about it except keep flying and hope. So the crew inside usually consisted of 10 men, 4 of whom were officers: the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier. The The rest were enlisted men serving as gunners, with some doubling as the flight engineer or radio operator. For protection, the B-17G model, which was the most produced and considered the definitive version, carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns pointing in every direction. On the belly was that infamous ball turret, a tight plexiglass ball barely 4 feet across. The gunner inside couldn't even wear his parachute, so it was kept in the fuselage. And in an emergency, he had to rotate the turret to line its small hatch with the one in the fuselage, then get someone to help him get back in, strap the chute on, and only then could he bail out. Now, good luck with doing all of that in the bomber already burning or spiraling out of control. You can imagine why nobody wanted that position. And also, enemy fighters knew that his turret was one of the most dangerous for them, so he was often the first one to go during an attack. It was described in a haunting poem written by one ball turret gunner, where he said that in the end he was washed out of the turret with a hose. That wasn't exaggeration. Crews saw what a direct 30mm cannon hit, or a burst of flak, could do to a human body. Many came back scarred for life after seeing their friends' bodies in conditions that defy description. The waist gunners statistically had the highest chance of being hit. They fired 2 single 50-caliber machine guns from open waist windows, with only freezing wind between them and enemy fire. Later versions finally introduced small plexiglass windows, which was at least something you could call comfort. Speaking of comfort, it's worth remembering they were flying in unpressurized cabins due to technology of the time. That meant, at altitudes of 25,000 feet and above, the air was so thin with oxygen that crews would lose consciousness in less than a minute if their oxygen masks malfunctioned. As temperature at that altitude went as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit, they wore heavy electrically heated suits that also tended to either stop working or heat too much. Touching bare metal without gloves could literally tear the skin off, and frostbite was common among crewmen. If the oxygen system failed, they had walk-around bottles, small portable cylinders with only enough supply to keep them alive long enough to descend to breathable altitude. Bailing out wasn't exactly a safer option either. The success rate was low, and estimates suggest that only about 1 in 4 B-17 crewmen who bailed out over enemy territory actually survived the entire ordeal, either by being captured or rescued. The bomber had several exits: the nose hatch, the bomb bay doors, the waist hatch, and one in the tail area. But in a damaged or spinning aircraft, most of those were either jammed, on fire, or blocked. The ball turret gunner, as we said, had no parachute with him, and the tail gunners was usually clipped behind him on the fuselage wall. In a spin, or with fire inside the tail, reaching for it was almost impossible. Many men went out without a parachute at all, either because it was destroyed by a hit, or because they never had a chance to grab it before being thrown off the bomber. Also, some actually chose to jump out without a parachute in such instances, choosing rather to die on impact than burning alive inside the bomber. There were weeks so bad that crews started calling them by name. The most infamous was the so-called Big Week in February 1944, when 244 bombers were destroyed in just 7 days, along with 33 escorting fighters. Around 2,600 men were killed, wounded, or captured in that single week. But as costly as it was, those raids played a huge role in establishing Allied air superiority over Europe and breaking the Luftwaffe. They also devastated Germany's fuel supply, which crippled its army on every front. Many German tanks were destroyed by their own crews after running out of fuel or breaking down due to lack of spare parts and fuel that the bombing campaign created. It's estimated that it shortened the war by about a year, but at a horrible cost of hundreds of thousands of civilians on the ground and tens of thousands of airmen who flew those missions. Now, the other dangers that killed so many B-17 crews came from formation flying itself. Pilots said that the hardest part of the mission was just getting into formation. They would take off from the runway in intervals of 30 seconds, one after another, with the next bomber already rolling while the first one was still trying to get airborne. Then, they had to assemble into an 18-plane V-shaped formation, which was later expanded to 36 bombers, and they had to do all of that in the horrible English weather with constant fog and low clouds. Many accidents happened with planes colliding into each other in clouds, especially when young, inexperienced pilots were still learning. Training alone killed thousands before they even saw combat. It's estimated that around 5,000 B-17 crewmen died in training accidents across the United States before even reaching their base in England, let alone going on a mission. However, as dangerous as it was to fly in one, formation significantly improved protection against German fighters. Studies after the war showed that about half of all B-17 shot down were those that had left their formation. Sometimes they broke away from lack of discipline under fire, but far more often the formation itself was torn apart by heavy flak, mechanical failure, or bombers crippled and lagging behind. Once a plane was alone, it was an easy target, so flying tight mattered. The formation gave them overlapping fields of fire, but at the same time came with cons. A single flak shell could hit several bombers at once, or just one, and the damaged bomber could lose control and crash into others in formation. There's also instances of friendly fire incidents during chaotic attacks, when hundreds of guns opened up at once on swarming fighters. B-17s did have a safety switch that was supposed to prevent a gun from firing if it was pointed at its own aircraft, but that didn't help much when other bombers were flying all around. In the middle of all that chaos, gunners sometimes found themselves firing straight across at bombers beside them. Those switches could also break, and it did happen that a gunner damaged his own plane by accident. It was chaos, pure and simple, and keeping anything under control in those conditions was almost impossible. Then came the most daring missions of all, the daylight raids on Berlin. Berlin was the most heavily defended city in all of Germany, of course, being the capital of Nazi Germany. It was ringed with anti-aircraft guns and surrounded by heavy concrete flak towers that could take direct hits from 500-pound bombs. Everything the Germans had was thrown into defending it. On March 6, 1944, during the first major daylight raid on Berlin, 69 bombers were shot down in a single day, which is the highest one-day loss ever suffered by the 8th Air Force. But those bombers also destroyed around 160 German fighters and set large parts of Berlin ablaze. In the final desperate years of the war, some Luftwaffe pilots even formed special ramming units. Their job was to literally crash into B-17s when they ran out of ammunition, hitting them with their own aircraft. It was basically a German version of kamikaze tactics. Several of these suicidal collisions actually happened, especially during the last year of the war when Germany was collapsing and desperation was all that was left. Throughout the war, Flying Fortress crews collectively fired over 90 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, shot down more than 18,000 German aircraft, and dropped about a third of the 1.6 million tons of bombs that the Allies dropped on Europe. But that came at a terrible price. Out of roughly 250,000 men who flew in B-17s during the war, more than 46,000 were killed, wounded or captured. Few other jobs in history have carried odds that bad.